this most important topic in Indian country or wherever we come from. Please give a round of applause to our presenter today, Kyle. It's really important to continue this discussion no matter where we come from. And yeah, is there climate change? One of my biggest things is water. Since we come from the Salish Sea, water is my home, and it's changing. And we have to live with it and try to work around change. But I'm really excited to listen to what he has to say about really what's going on globally. You know, it's just not here. I have friends in New Zealand. They brag about New Zealand's water is pure. The Maoris say it isn't. Change, yeah. But anyways, I'm glad to have my members of my class here today. They've been asked to ask a lot of questions, and they're going to report back Monday to their cohorts. Right? Yeah. So anyways, thank you for coming. Thank you for spending time with Northwest Indian College. I'm hoping this grounds our students, our members a little more who we are as Native Americans and have a better understanding of what's taking place in everybody's world, yeah? But welcome to Northwest. I'm really glad you're here, and it's important.
So I just wanted to thank Tim Ballou, Senior, former Chairman of the Lummi Nation, Lummi Community Member, providing a welcome to Dr. Kyle Whyte. I don't want to spend too much time giving another introduction, but I also was moved to make sure that we recognize the full breadth of the expertise in the room from our Lummi community members, our students, but also to bring in Kyle is wonderful and based on relationships and reciprocity. I want to acknowledge that Kyle's not only a prolific writer, scholar, activist. He's incredibly generous with his time. I know he's Skyped into my classes, Dr. Compton's classes before, and is always willing to share his work. And in the last conversation that we had said, I'll let you know when I'm in Seattle and I'll come up, and you're true to your word. You did that, and I really appreciate the opportunity for you to come and visit and get to know our college. So in terms of his bio, Kyle is a Potawatomi and an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. His work focuses on climate and environmental justice and indigenous environmental studies. His primary research addresses moral and political issues concerning climate policy and indigenous peoples and the ethics of cooperative relationships between indigenous peoples and science organizations. His work has recently extended to cover issues to indigenous food sovereignty and indigenous critiques of concepts of the Anthropocene. Kyle holds the Timnick Chair of the Humanities and is an associate professor of philosophy and community sustainability at Michigan State University. He is faculty member of the Environmental Philosophy and Ethics Graduate Concentration and serves as a faculty affiliate of the American Studies and Environmental Science and Policy programs. So with that, with Tim Ballou's welcome and welcome on behalf of the Native Environmental Science Program at Northwest Indian College, welcome Dr. Kyle Whyte.
Bonjour everyone. It's great to be here, and I've been a fan for years of Northwest Indian College, been a fan of the Lummi tribe and all the great environmental work the tribe does, whether on the science end or on the activism end. And so I just want to first have a bit of applause for all the great work that you all do. Yeah. And just in my experience, having met folks that teach here or have graduated from here, everyone's doing such high impact work. I work at a university, and everybody on my campus is always really concerned about whether their research is going to have an impact on somebody. But when I hear about the work that the folks are doing here and actually see it in action when I travel around to different events, the folks that study and work here just automatically have an impact and automatically does good things in their communities and their nations. And so as Native people, we don't always have that hang up, do we? Right? We know our work matters. And so it's fantastic to see that tradition over generations continue on here. And I know people from my tribe, Potawatomi, which is part of the Anishinaabe, we were very inspired by all of the actions that the Lummi tribe has taken on a number of issues. And we've been watching from afar, and it's been helping energize us for the actions that we're trying to take in our own region to protect ourselves against environmental threats. So I just want to honor everybody who's here, and it's awesome to have a chance to share with you all and connect with you all. And so I think for today's session, given about the time that we are starting, I was hoping to talk for a little bit. I probably won't be able to get through every single topic that's on the slides, which is probably a good idea because we should probably have a good chunk of time to chat. So I'll sort of cruise through the slides as best as I can and then try to find a good place to move toward closing, because I know that some of you all are required in your courses to ask questions, really hard ones. In Professor Blue's class, do you get extra credit if you stump me? Like if I don't know what to respond? That extra points? Okay, that's what I thought. Maybe an extra 10 points? Yeah. Okay, fantastic. So the slides are a little bit small today given the size of the screen and where everybody's sitting. So I think we'll do two things. So on the one hand, if you're like sitting up and around here, you can probably see the slides. If you are farther away, you're going to kind of depend on oral tradition. And so I'll do my best to convey everything that's on the slides. And for those who can actually see the slides, you can kind of check to make sure that I'm telling folks in the back the right things that are on it. But I go through the slides pretty quickly, so it's probably best anyways just to kind of listen to what I'm saying. And since this is a tribal audience here, you all can ask questions anytime you want. I'm happy to interrupt the presentation. If I don't see you, just speak up, but it's all good. So a little bit about myself and what I do. So I'm a Potawatomi person, which is part of the larger Anishinaabe group. We're a big tribe, primarily in the Great Lakes region, but now all over North America. And for me, what's been very important is that for Anishinaabe people, we have tremendous traditions, like the tribes in this region, of honoring the non-human world around us. And so I've really devoted my work to protecting species like sturgeon, sturgeon conservation, wild rice, which is a traditional food for us. And these are really the efforts that inspire me, whether it's actually engaging with the plants and animals and with the natural environment itself, or whether it's being part of political events that seek to bring us together as Native people with our allies to actually protect those things that are important to us. And so really when I think about what motivates me to do the work I do, whether it's as a writer or a scientist or academic or tribal member, is the importance of that intimacy and that engagement at the moral level with the non-human world. I'm also somebody that spends most of my time actually in the tribal college environment. I've had a decade-long relationship with the Sustainable Development Institute at the College of Menominee Nation and the Menominee tribe there in what's currently called Wisconsin. And they have a fantastic tribal college with inspiring students like many of you all. And they developed their own institute for research that works at a range of topics in sustainability, and they developed it in 1994. And so, like so much of the work that happens at tribal colleges, a lot of things happen here early, and before a lot of non-native higher education institutes actually catch on. And so the Menominee is very much in that situation. And we do fantastic work together. We do educational programs. We put together teams of students and researchers to work specifically with tribes on climate change planning. In our camps and educational programs, it's all dialogue and discussion based. I've been a firm believer that We learn best when we share each other's wisdom and knowledge instead of like doing what I'm doing right now. So it's all dialogue and discussion based. We do conferences. This is a climate change conference together that brought a whole bunch of Native folks together to talk about the issues they're facing with climate change and actually tell non-Native scientists how we think collaboration should occur. And so I've had fantastic relationships in this decade-long work with the College of Menominee Nation. The lesser part of my work is my job at Michigan State University, where I'm a professor, and I do things like write papers. But the best part of my job is on my campus. We've got fantastic Native students, fantastic Native faculty, fantastic allies. We have a good time together. And even though we're in an environment where not everybody on campus has really heard about sovereignty and that sort of thing, we do our best and we support each other, and people go on to do great things. I work with the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians. We have a tribal climate camp that we do every year. I've been part of a work group on protecting traditional knowledge in relation to climate scientists called the Climate and Traditional Knowledges Work Group. I was an author on the 4th National Climate Assessment, which is the United States version of figuring out what is happening with regard to climate change, and we just put out a report a few months ago, despite the Trump administration's attempts to stop us from doing so. I'm part of a lot of great networks. One is Rising Voices, which is an indigenous network that seeks to build awareness for climate scientists in terms of how they can better support the work that we're doing. I've been part of the policy world too. I was on a federal committee before the Trump administration canceled it called the Advisory Committee on Climate Change and Natural Resources Science. And internationally, I also get a chance to connect with Native people all over the world. And just like Professor Blue was saying, when I go to events like this, which is a United Nations event, and I meet indigenous people from all over the world, all of them are working on climate change in some way. Whether you're from Asia or South America, everybody's working on climate change, even if they have various focus areas. And so for me, working on climate change has been inspiring to connect to other Native people who, just like we was talking about before, are all affected. And even though our situations are a little bit different, there is kind of a weird similarity. And I think that sharing of that similarity is very important for strengthening and affirming who we are. So for today's presentation, in the time that I'll have to share, which as you can see, given the speed that I talk at, I'll be able to share quite a bit. I wanted to focus on this idea that as Native people, we're architects of massive efforts to address climate change and to achieve climate justice. And by climate justice, I just mean something pretty straightforward, which is the idea that we know, whether it's from our own relatives or whether it's from science, that the temperature has been rising, that's been destabilizing the climate system, and that the fossil fuel industry and other industrial sources are bringing about these changes. And it's not our societies that actually really cause these things. Yeah, Native people dabble in some fossil fuel and some other stuff, but at the end of the day, it's not really us that's behind this. And so climate justice is kind of this idea that why is it that we're being affected by things that we didn't necessarily cause ourselves? And so the climate justice movement is our attempt to not only figure out how to adapt to changes, but how to tell the rest of the world that they need to change their behavior for the sake of future generations. And so when you look at the indigenous climate change and climate justice movement broadly, one of the things that I find is that there's a tremendous insight when we talk about indigenous climate justice in terms of how we understand our relationship to time and to knowledge. And so I want to talk here about, I'll probably get to about 3 different senses of time, and maybe I'll talk about the 4th type of time. But when I think about all the different ways that indigenous people are experiencing climate change, there are different ways of thinking about time. profound time, seasonal time, kinship time, and the one I probably won't get to is dystopian time. But these are all ways in which we experience the environment, the natural world. And so I'm kind of going to tell my version of the story of Indigenous climate justice through talking about time. So to begin with, and this part of the presentation is a lot about climate science. When we think about something like profound time, well, what do I mean by that? Well, one thing that I notice when I work with non-native people is they oftentimes have like a pretty short understanding of time. Like the key period of time that they focus on is maybe like the last couple hundred years. But as native people, oftentimes we speak about time immemorial. We're always putting things in perspective in a much longer history. And so one of the questions that is related to this is when people ask, well, when did human beings actually start studying climate change? When did it actually occur? When did humans actually begin to study climate change? And to put it straightforwardly, if you ask white people about that, they'll oftentimes cite scientists like Fourier in the 19th century that came up with the greenhouse effect, people living a couple hundred years ago or in the 1950s, like this is an example of the Keeling curve, right? Or they'll talk about people that, in the last couple hundred years have been studying these big periods of time like the Holocene and the Anthropocene. And so when you look at what a lot of scientists say, right, that humans have really just been studying climate change for a very short period of time. And so when you ask the question, well, how long have humans been studying climate change, at least in the university that I work at or at other universities, it's really just recent individuals that have been studying climate change. And oftentimes the study of climate change isn't really tied to questions of personal responsibility for maintaining a clean environment. And oftentimes a lot of non-native people are like, wow, now that we know that the climate change is occurring rapidly, we've never had to deal with such a moral and political problem, a problem about responsibility. And you get this other idea that even among non-native folks who believe that people have been reacting to climate change for a long, long time, they don't usually say that they were studying it, right? The people that studied it were usually European people or white American people in the last couple of hundred years. And so I found that this isn't a very profound sense of time, because it's this idea that climate change has only been studied for a couple hundred years, and that means, right, that it's a relatively new topic for us. But if you ask native folks, including a couple of folks that are here, climate change has been part of our history and science for generations. Like, as native people, we've been studying climate change as far back as we can remember. For Anishinaabe people, for example, one of our oldest stories is actually a migration story, and this is like time immemorial stuff, where it's a set of stories about how we moved from place to place. Each place we moved to, we found a new environment, a new set of habitats, and we had to learn how to adapt to that new environment. And each story almost always has a lesson that if you try to dominate that environment, you're probably not going to be able to feed yourself. If you try to dominate the people who already live there, probably not going to be able to live well and to survive. Each story is actually about how when the climate changes, in this sense, when you move from one climate region to another, that you have to be open to establishing respectful relationships, and you have to find out what your responsibility is to the non-human world, so that the non-human world ends up doing you some favors back. And so notice that it's a set of stories about how humans adapt to environmental change, in which the very idea of morality or responsibility is built into how we think about how we respond to environmental and climate change. And throughout the Anishinaabe world, these ideas and stories relating to climate change and how we come to know climate change and other types of environmental change are found everywhere. The work of Annette Lee, for example, looks at Anishinaabe star systems, which were corresponding to Anishinaabe understandings of how to live according to the seasons. Tribal colleges, for example, have done a lot of work designing models like this that show Anishinaabe traditions of how you live seasonally. And what I think a lot of people in the non-native world actually don't understand is that our societies explicitly for generations, and many of us would argue still today, were actually based on the idea that a good society, a good way of governing, was one that was adaptive to seasonal change, and that anticipated trends in interannual change, that is, long-term trends in seasons. And what's interesting about this is that we find ourselves in like the United States right now, where the United States has one government, and it's really static, and it's really boring, and it's really not attuned to the environment. At least for Anishinaabe people, and I think a lot of folks here, depending on what tribe you're from, can identify with this, we didn't have one boring, static government. We had a whole bunch of governments. We had clans, we had lodges, we had different families, all of which were attuned to different aspects of the environment and to seasonal change. And they were always shifting. They were always moving in order to be as respectful as possible to a constantly changing environment. Yes, sir?
I think I want to get your thought on how many seasons are really we living in?
That's a great question. Professor Ballou asked how many seasons are we actually living in. So I used to think that I had a really good answer to that question, and it turned out like I was completely wrong about it. And from an Anishinaabe perspective, the way that we look at it, right, is there's 13 seasons if you're looking at the lunar cycle, right? But then there's also different broader seasons. So some people say there's 13 seasons. There's 6 of these other broader types of seasons. But then each family, because there's variation in climate and microclimate, has its own conception of seasons as well that are local to it. And so in models like this, oftentimes that might be the model for the general society, but then each family would have a version of it. And so for us that meant there were many, many different types of seasons. However, I did want to ask, did you have also another answer to that too?
Well, we discussed this in our class last week, and we all agreed there wasn't 4 seasons. Yeah, coming from a native background, no matter where we come from, and it's been said for hundreds of years that we may have 16 seasons that we really live in, and we're supposed to understand it, and that's part of what's taking place today is we don't respect the natural world as much as we should, I think. But I was just curious what your thought is on the seasons. Our class members can testify that we spoke about this and really what we're living in today. You know, you speak about time all the time, yeah? You know, what is it? It's not that on the wall there, you know. But anyways, I needed to ask that question.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I'm gonna do a little bit of divergence because it's an important topic that, you know, when I looked at our history, and I was going to mention this a little bit later, but it's really pertinent now because you mentioned time, right? Is a lot of our ancestors really wouldn't have seen the world as like a 12-month world, or like you were saying, this 4 seasons idea. Is that they had an extremely fine-grained way of understanding how each person might have hundreds of different responsibilities that were associated with who they were, that were connected to different changes that were occurring throughout the year and across different years. And so, for example, if you met somebody back in the day, and a lot of Native folks, this is still how they are, But if you met somebody back in the day, the idea that you would tell them your name or where you came from wouldn't necessarily have been of how people would have thought of their identity. Instead, you would tell people about what your responsibilities were. And people would have understood that if you say, oh, this is what your responsibility is, this meant that during the winter months, you'd be up in this region. And maybe in the hotter months, you'd be down here. Because people understood that morality was associated with the places that you lived at different parts of the season. And so there's a couple of interesting approaches to understanding our system of governance. Like my tribe, the Potawatomi, historically didn't really exist. Potawatomi, as far as we know, was a band level type of government that existed during a certain part of the year when it was advantageous to be that way, but it quickly devolved into smaller governments other times of the year. So it expanded, it shrunk, it shaped, formed different shapes and sizes, and so it was extremely fluid. And a lot of people think that Native folks, at least in the Great Lakes region, but other parts, one of the reasons why we survived an onslaught of one of the most powerful forces in the world was because we knew how to shift and change in size. That actually helped us. And so a lot of non-Native folks, if you look at the historical record, were completely confused by who we were, which is why they tried to call us tribal groups or bands. But people, like Professor Blue was saying, wouldn't necessarily have thought that way. They were thinking about what their responsibilities were across seasons, and that's how they understood time, right? Time was not what's on the clock. Time was the time of fulfilling a responsibility. Now multiply that by hundreds of responsibilities, a very different way of thinking about time. And so I think it's really important to kind of put this in perspective. I talked to a lot of different cities or other groups that are planning for climate change, and they'll say things like, our government of city X isn't really designed to adjust to environmental change. And I'll say that's really ironic because actually for thousands of years, that was how the government worked in this particular region. It's just like the last 200 years that it's been different. And so this is this idea of profound time, of always understanding what's right in front of you in terms of that deeper history. So if a climate scientist tells you, oh, well, the first person that discovered the greenhouse effect was in sometime in the 19th century, we don't want to assume that that was the first time that somebody really started studying climate change. And that's what it means to have a profound respect for deep time. In the same way, when I come here, I don't assume that Anishinaabe were the first people to live seasonally. We couldn't have been. All sorts of people were living seasonally. And that's what's having that respect for the long history of time. It's an ethical way of being. It's a moral way of being. And another thing about climate change, which is really interesting too, is a lot of climate scientists I've worked with, they'll say things like, all right, I know that indigenous people have empirical and scientific knowledge, and it's on par with what scientists come up with. But there's still one difference. Indigenous knowledge is local. And climate science, right through aerial photography or satellite imagery, is broad and regional and global. Well, what's interesting about that is, again, that's wrong too, because we know from stories in our own communities, but also for what historians tell us, that we had vast networks based on kinship that reached across an entire continent. And that actually those networks were all about timing when people would trade. And without cell phones and other types of technologies, you had to be sharing a lot of knowledge about other people's seasons to be able to have that level of coordination. And so in that way, right, somebody who is from what we now currently call Michigan could have known quite a bit about what's currently called South Dakota, because they were engaging each year in that exchange. And so it's also important to realize that our knowledge systems, our study of climate change, has also been regional and continental in scale. And in academic work like this, and I'll send you all my slides if you ever want these citations, Susan Sleeper-Smith, Michael Whitkin, they're historians of the Great Lakes region, they tell these histories, and they tell it very well. So in our language, in the Anishinaabe language, you notice that our word for land is actually a word that encompasses what it means to be an adaptive society, a respectful society for being able to adjust to environmental change, and that morality is built into it. Yirakimanon, right? It's not just the word land, which just like in English, land is just kind of a pretty, I don't know, it doesn't seem to denote a lot, right? You have to kind of explain the significance it has, if it even has that significance. Some people just say land in English, it means like property. It doesn't matter what's on it, who lives there's property, a deed, a fee. But in our languages, and this is just one example, and it's not even necessarily the only word for land, it means everything that's there, how it's connected, and the moral responsibilities that are part of it. And so even our language, right, has climate change built into it. And so to speed through a couple of slides here, it's not just Anishinaabe people, it is everybody, right? These are the Lakota winter counts. This is a Koyukon seasonal wheel. This is another, I think, tribal college project, the Nez Perce seasonal round. Right? All of these are cases in which tribes from everywhere were living according to more than 4 seasons, and we're studying climate change for generations. And so when we say, well, when did people first start to study climate change? It's time immemorial. And actually what we refer to as climate science today is a relatively young phenomenon, as Professor Montgomery said in that quote that I put up earlier, right? It's new. And this is, I think, incredibly powerful because if you've ever read the work of Native historian Jean O'Brien, she talks about the tendency for non-Native people to always say that they were the first at things. Even when they were not only not the first, but they were really behind, or they've just forgotten their own history, right? They've just forgotten their own history. Yes?
We never forgot. It was they took it from us.
Yep, that's great. What's your name? What's your name?
My name?
Yeah.
Williams. My English name is Byron. But because of the white people, we can't speak our own language. They took everything.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good point. And that's what I think is funny about when non-Native people forget their own past, because they forget how hard we've worked to preserve those aspects of our memory and so on that were stolen from us.
We lost part of our culture and our heritage because of them.
Yeah.
And our language.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me in my work, that's why it's been tremendously important for me, the people I work with, to do what we can to bring back that heritage as much as possible. And I think, like you're indicating, some of it may be things that, are too far gone to be able to bring back. But I think we have a lot of lessons from our ancestors that can support us building strong societies again. There's a lot we can draw on. But thanks for speaking up. I appreciate it. So, for us, climate change and its study is just part of how you organize society. And climate and environmental change sciences are actually the oldest sciences. They're not new ones. And climate science throughout generations has always been about different scales, regional scales, and so on. So as Native people, we can always actually understand who we are as people who've been studying climate change for a long, long time. And I think whenever we're in conversations with folks in the climate science world, we need to approach things that way. We need to occupy that space with that in mind. And that doesn't mean that all of us are like know-it-alls, right? No, because we have a respect for also what we don't know. Because what I actually remind folks is that while Native people historically had a lot of knowledge to live among the seasons, when you're living in a subsistence way, there's actually a premium placed on being respectful of what you don't know. Because if you act out of ignorance, that's probably going to be your last move. And so in another presentation, one thing that's important, I think, to focus on, right, is this idea that indigenous knowledge systems are both knowledge systems about having deep and intimate knowledge about the land. At the same time, they're knowledge systems where there's a premium placed on being very much self-aware about what you don't know, and not taking certain risks when you have no idea what you're doing. And so in this part of the presentation, just keep thinking about time in a sense that I said I wasn't supposed to talk about, because we're not talking about linear time. But I'm going to go over this part of the presentation more quickly because we already talked about some of the themes. So the second part of time is seasonal time. And so seasonal time is the idea that instead of living your life around 24 hours and 60 minutes and 365 days, I know there's a year that has 66 or something like that. Instead of living your life in that way, you live your life around the interplay of environmental change and your responsibilities to other people. And so if I had a little bit more time, what I would show in this part of the presentation is some of the research I've been part of with great folks like Samantha Chisholm Hatfield, as well as some of the work of other folks that I admire, such as climate scientists, as well as stuff that tribes have put out. Like, if some of you have seen this recent study that the Umatilla tribe did on food sovereignty and climate change, it's fantastic tribal work, and actually reminds me of a lot of the projects that many of you were describing earlier today. But for some reason you can't get a hold of the article, send me an email. I'll illegally send you the PDF. So it's fantastic work. And so I was going to go in a little bit more detail about some of these really interesting studies about what it actually means to live your life in a seasonal sense. And so in addition to those studies, I was going to talk about some of my older work on deer hunting, which I can also send to you, which was very much focused on this idea of what does it mean to base your life on being adaptive to seasonal change. And what I'd like to just say briefly about that work, and I provide a lot of really cool literature on it for you to read further on if you're not already aware of the literature, is in a society that lives seasonally, the goal is how are you as fluid as possible? How can you be as fluid as possible so that a change that happens in the environment does not catch you off guard? Now, what's the basis of that society? It's not science. We're in the sense of science of information. It's not, do I have information about when the seasons change? It's actually about coordination. Do you have relationships with humans and non-humans in which you're adequately coordinated so that no matter if a change is predictable or unpredictable, you know how to mobilize? So what makes coordination? Well, for me, what's the best coordinated aspect of my life? My family. My family, and I bet a lot of your families are like this too, if any network of relationships that you're part of is going to respond quickly to something, it's your family. If something bad happens to a family member, I'm going to call somebody in my family and say, well, we need to do something to address this. I don't need to tell them who I am. I don't need to establish trust, because we're family, we trust each other. We don't need to worry about whether I'm asking them to do something that they don't consent to, that they don't want to do, because we're family. We've bonded over the years. And I know there's reciprocity. For example, if I ask a cousin to do something, it's not like asking a stranger where you don't know if they're going to pay it back. When it's family, there's a stronger sense of reciprocity. Now, I know that all of us have weird things going on in our families in different ways, so I'm not presenting it as a perfect picture. But what I am saying is it's actually kinship relationships that afford you the best capacity to respond to problems in a coordinated way. Why? Because your family relations are among the most trustworthy, the most consensual, and the most reciprocal that you have. So when a family mobilizes, for good or for bad, it's highly effective. And so when I was thinking about this, and thinking about our stories, what ancestors had said, what scholars had written about, that seasonal time was actually a time where you understood yourself, not in terms of 12 months, or 7 days, or 60 minutes, but you understood yourself as constantly responding to cues in the environment through this coordinated network that was thick with trust, consent, and reciprocity. So if somebody asked you, well, how long is it going to take you to harvest wild rice this year? You wouldn't say, well, it usually takes about a week, or it usually takes about 3 months. You wouldn't have said that. You would actually reflect on, well, wait a minute, if I'm going to harvest in this region, and I don't know the people there, and they don't trust me, that's probably going to take a long time. It's long because the trust isn't there. Or if people haven't consented to my being in the land, well, that could take a long time for them to consent to me being there. Whereas if I'm going to harvest rice in a region I've been going to for years and my closest family lives there, I know that I'll be able to harvest probably in that year. And so we experience time through relationships of trust and consent and reciprocity, among other qualities. And this is why Native people everywhere talk about kinship relationships. That some of the solutions to our problems are in kinship relationships. And I'm not giving a universal, by far, definition of kinship relationships. I'm just telling you what it means to me, is a kinship relationship is one that is thick with trust, thick with reciprocity, thick with consent. And by consent, I also mean that it's a relationship where you have a right to speak your mind. It's with my family that if I see something that's going wrong, I can dissent to that and call somebody out and I won't get in trouble. It's good when family do that. They keep each other honest. And so kinship then is an important way of thinking about time. And so, the last part of the presentation, what I want to talk about, skipping ahead a bit, is how this idea of understanding ourselves seasonally and in terms of kinship has been a huge part of an incredible indigenous and climate justice movement. And I want to talk about some key examples that I see when I'm working out there. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go through stuff really, really quickly, see all the interesting things that were embedded in here. Okay. So if you are somebody who is thinking about the world in terms of kinship, if climate change is an old topic that you've been engaged in for a long time, and you're confronted today with the idea that the fossil fuel industries behind deforestation, nation states, industrialization, that these are increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is destabilizing the climate, you would interpret that, wouldn't you, as a breakdown in kinship. For a society, and more than one, to dominate the landscape, to dominate the world with mines, with mega malls, with military, is that a society that is acting in a trustworthy way? Is that a society that, going back to your point earlier, right, a society that strips you of your knowledge and traditions, that lays waste to your lands? Is that a society that respects your consent? Is that a society that is trustworthy? Is that a society that's reciprocal? Is that a society that's acting in a responsible way? Absolutely not. And so for us, when we actually think And it's not just me. I talk to Native folks all over, and there's people that say this in different ways. But for me, this is how I say it. Climate change, the current climate change, is actually a massive breakdown in kinship caused by other societies. So for me, climate change is not just about how much gas is in the atmosphere. That's a symptom. But it's more fundamentally about how colonialism, capitalism, and industrialization need to be stopped, or we're not actually going to be able to solve some of the climate change problems that we're facing today. And so if you look at a lot of environmentalists, including many here in Washington State, they don't talk about colonialism. They talk a little bit about capitalism, talk a little bit about industrialization, but they don't talk about colonialism when they talk about why we're in the current predicament we are with climate change. And as I'll share shortly in a second, it's Native people who are among the populations that are facing the greatest risks. Whether it's risks from changing precipitation patterns, changing habitats, sea level rise and coastal erosion, ocean acidification, we're facing more risks than most other people. And we're joined by other groups of people, such as people of color, who have also faced colonialism and exploitation through capitalism and industrialization. And so my opinion is that when we first think about what's the problem with climate change, we automatically think that the problem is how trust, consent, and reciprocity, kinship, have fallen out of balance, and that that's what's generating the risk. So that the solution must involve transforming our relations with others to be more trustworthy, consensual, and reciprocal, to be kinship relations again. Not that all of these folks are ones that we want to be kin with, but still, it's a model. And these next few slides, and I'll send out the link to everybody so you can see the citations. I just point out here that Native Studies scholars have been saying this for years. And it's actually Indigenous Studies which has made important points about climate change even before some scientists got to make those points. And so scholars like Megan Bang and Dan Wildcat and Robin Kimmerer and Candace Callison, Sheila Watt-Cloutier, all of these folks have made tremendous contributions to how we understand the relationship between capitalism, colonialism, and climate change. And folks like Lee Miracle in the arts have made important points about these connections. And so if we understand what we've been through at the hands of the United States, notice that colonialism actually is an infliction of climate change on us, of harmful climate change on us. It's not the first time another society has imposed climate change on us. My tribe was relocated to Oklahoma, forced to change climate region. When the US didn't honor its treaties, a lot of our ancestors actually agreed to treaties that would allow us to stay adaptive. But those were precisely the things the US did not want. And so the treaty system and tribes in this region have been particularly profound in the work they've done to go back to what those treaties were originally about, to honor those intentions, right, is actually about trying to find diplomatic and legal means to be adaptive again. That's one way of understanding what a treaty right is, which goes way beyond the idea that it's just a right to property or a right to use land in a certain way. When they liquidated our lands into private property, when they cajoled many of our societies to invest in the fossil fuel industry, like my tribe, when they laced our landscape with pipelines, that's not trustworthy. That's not consensual, which is why Native Studies scholars like Ann Spice call it invasive infrastructure. So when we think about all of the things that happen to us, right, and I'm skipping ahead on a few things, it all turns out that they are massive breakdowns in kinship. And they were inflicting climate change on us going way back. So that today's infliction of climate change, it can't possibly get better unless the actual situation with colonialism is changed and transformed. So people that advocate in this region, for example, for treaty rights, whether they use the term climate change or not, they're advocating for climate justice. People that advocate for tribal economies that are not kind of pressured into the fossil fuel industry and have more diverse options for how they can make a living are advocating for climate change. And so when I was an author on the National Climate Assessment, and I'll just start to wrap up here, we synthesized like just hundreds of testimonies and articles and reports by indigenous peoples everywhere, and found that no matter who you are, what tribe you're from, climate change today is probably on your mind. And so, for example, a lot of folks said their livelihoods and economies are at risk. You know, here I think about the fishery. In other parts of Turtle Island, we think about other industries which are based on the land, or even areas like tourism affected by climate change. But if you look at what we put in this scientific report, the cause is not the climate. Because what's really shocking and horrifying is a lot of the changes that we're experiencing today, our ancestors wouldn't have had a big problem with. Because they had the fluidity and adjustability to move around and adjust. But today, with the disrespected treaties, the reservation system, the liquidation of our reservations into private property, those make it actually harder to deal with changes that our ancestors wouldn't have had as big of a problem with. And so that's why in the report, if you read carefully the language in it, we hold the United States, we hold companies, we hold bureaucracies responsible for those changes, right? So sea level rise, or a change in precipitation or a change in habitat, is not just, shoot, native people are living a subsistence lifestyle and then this change occurs. It's actually that the relationships with the United States, or with the state of Washington, or with the counties, or with the municipalities are not strong enough like they were historically to be able to actually respond proactively to change. And so in the report you'll see that the burden of responsibility is actually on improving the relationships we have with the United States and with all other levels of government with non-native people. Which is hard, right? If, as our friend over here was saying, these are people that their ancestors, and even some of them today, are ones that took nearly everything from us, but our spirits. And so we pointed out that actually for native people, climate change is an existential, it's a spiritual issue. And indigenous people are among the first people to actually have to permanently move from the places they live now to new locations. And guess what's the biggest problem every time a tribe tries to resettle is the relationships with the United States and with other levels of government. So those are where improvement needs to occur. They need to be more trustworthy, more consensual, more reciprocal. And what is really encouraging to me, and this will be the last few things that I show in the abridged version of the presentation, is when we looked in the report at how many things Native people are doing to address climate change, we found over 800 activities just in the US sphere. Now, in the state of Michigan, there are 10 million people, which is way more people than there are Indians. We do not have 800 climate change initiatives. So when I said earlier that Native people are architects of climate change and climate justice movement, I wasn't kidding. And look at all the areas we've influenced. Tribal colleges, the Sustainable Development Institute, founded in 1994. 1998 was the first time Native folks here got involved in climate science. In the 1990s, it wasn't last year, we've been involved in climate science and reform of climate science for almost 3 decades. And if I had a little bit more time, I'd show you some other details here, which is that in the early work, which by the way was led by who? Tribal colleges. It was a tribal college-led intervention with the US Global Change Research Program. They were pointing out that it was about politics, that it was about trust, consent, reciprocity. That was a key message in that scientific report. We've had tremendous leaders like Sheila Watt-Cloutier pointing out things like it's not just how do you avoid warming, it's about the right to be cold. And so in the longer version, I go into some of the quotes. But again, she makes a lot of the same connections that I'm making now. I know all of you all know who this is, right? Billy Frank, who already had decades of treaty rights activism, was also on the forefront of organizing meetings at the national and international level on climate change, like the first Stewards Symposium, an international indigenous meeting led by Billy Frank Jr. and tribes from here. Activity after activity, I already told you about Rising Voices earlier. Numerous scientific reports. We've even focused on issues of gender that non-native people didn't understand. In this technical report I was part of, right, we had to tell the US government that for native people we see gender differently, right? It's not just men and women, it's two-spirit people, and everybody's affected in unique ways by climate change. Federal committees, like I talked about earlier, even the National Congress of American Indians, which oftentimes is beholden to tribes that produce dirty energy, advocated for climate change principles. We set up a group just trying to change accountability between climate scientists and indigenous people. Oh, another tribal college-led initiative, right? Haskell Indian Nations University, the Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Working Group, which had meetings every year on climate change. Northwest Indian College, the Environmental Science Program. And isn't Northwest Indian College a Leo Center too? Yeah, exactly. Taking leadership. Tribes were among the first groups to do climate change plans. The Akwesasne tribe did its own climate change plan according to its own traditions. The Swinomish tribe had one of the first indigenous climate change plans. Scholars, right, like a friend of this region, Alan Parker, produced incredible work talking about all that Native people are doing to address climate change. And whenever there's a climate change rally, we show up. Native people are right there. In terms of fighting the fossil fuel industry and generating alternatives, groups like the late Bob Goff and his colleagues, the Intertribal Council on Utility Policy, the village of Kivalina went after in lawsuit form the fossil fuel industry, one of the first climate-related lawsuits. The Inuit petition to the Inter-American Court at the human rights level. And from here, the Treaty Tribes of Western Washington, one of the best climate change initiatives, barely says climate change, the Treaty Rights at Risk Initiative, all about building local resilience. Native scholars such as Sarah Deer pointing out that if you really understand, like I've been saying, climate change as a breakdown in kinship and consent, you'd know why sexual violence and the fossil fuel industry are related problems. The proliferation of the fossil fuel industry is also the proliferation of violence against Native women, especially in the man camps that are created. And scholars such as Melanie Yazzie are pointing out that even in tribes like the Navajo Nation that have struggled for a long time, right, with fossil fuels, that there were folks like John Redhouse that for years were mapping out the issues and presenting alternatives. So it's not just in the last 10 years that Native people have been calling attention to this, it's decades. Look up Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Declarations. You'll find them all over the place, very powerful. At the highest human rights level, people like Vicky Talley-Corpus, right, has put climate change as a global agenda for Indigenous people. That was the picture I showed you earlier about Native people from all over who are working on climate change. And just recently, right, whether it's the Standing Rock tribe, right, whether it's the Unistaden camp, or whether it's our relatives right here, the Lummi, been taking action to blunt and stop the fossil fuel industry and have had some success, such as that little coal issue here, right? Which inspires us all. So I'm going to go ahead and close. And the last thing I would just say on this slide is that if you don't believe me that kinship in terms of trust, consent, and reciprocity is the most important thing, then I would go into great length about how when the rest of the world engages in solutions such as forest conservation, hydropower, most of these solutions, even though they create cleaner forms of energy, just go back to oppressing Native people. Like they literally brought hydropower back as a solution. Even though hydropower in the 80s and 90s had been taken off the table because it displaced Native people, they just brought it back as a clean energy solution as if none of that had ever happened. Or with forest conservation programs like the UN RED program, reducing emissions from forest deforestation, forest degradation. They thought that they could just figure out ways for people that lived in forests to get paid, even though many of those countries still had not repaired and healed the issues of jurisdiction with native people living in those areas. You have a country that doesn't believe there are indigenous people living in the forest. How is that indigenous people going to get payments for conservation? And so what we see is that until kinship relations are improved, even the solutions will not work. And so for us, when we think about climate justice, we're not buying into the bizarre and false solutions. We're always coming back to that conception of time, whether it's profound time or seasonal time or kinship time. That's where we're working from. And that's why for us, it is about relationships. It is about morality. And the idea that somehow climate change presents new moral issues or things like that, that's old hat for us. And that's why I'm really inspired to not only be here, but to be part of the Indigenous climate justice movement with all of you, because that's what we're fighting for. And there's so much positive that our communities are doing that we can draw on, but also so much pain. So I look forward to chatting with you all later. Thanks for coming and hanging out. Yes.
Would I be able to review on your website?
Yep, and let me show, I'm going to do it here because it's faster. So one is you can always email me anytime you want, and I'll send you this, but I put a link, sorry. See, it was so simple when I made it, but then, all right. We're just going to do it the old-fashioned way. So there's a link here where it's public. Yeah, because I was hoping to, but you can, if this doesn't make sense, it doesn't work, just send me a quick email. Just be like, send me the slides. I'll definitely do it, because there's a lot of citations and a lot of literature I wanted to show you all. Because I'm very excited about what Native people are doing, and I've got PDFs, I've got files, I've got it all. Thank you.
I'm glad that you have this. I've read that one of your speeches before last year. I'm thinking about it's nice because you have a lot of really great stuff to be able to use in reports and a lot of our work that we might have to do for our papers and stuff. But I had a couple of questions, but one, I kind of think about this idea of us having all these different seasons that we talk about constantly. There's lunar cycles, we have multiple different seasons depending on the regions that we live in. You know, here we have a very kind of mildish winter, but we have these long falls and springs, whereas like further south that might be very different. We're talking about even just from families to families. And I think about how we have, as this contemporary world, we think of 4 seasons. Like globally, people think about this. And I wonder how we even got to this idea of 4 seasons, because to drop all of these other seasons and acknowledging these seasons, what kind of benefit would that give the human race to just completely disregard these time periods that we know exist, we experience them, and we're cognizant of it? Because I don't feel like we really drop things like that without a reason. You know, it's not, I don't think that people just forgot about them. But I don't know if you have any insight on that.
Yeah, what's your name again?
I'm Jen Love, and I'm from Swinomish.
Okay, great. Nice to meet you. Yeah, so I'm curious, one, whether anybody here knows the like the precise answer to that. Because I don't have the precise answer of like where the 4 seasons come from. However, I do have like a suspicion that's slightly related to it. But I also think there's probably some. Is anyone like with a background in like almanacs and that type of thing know where that came from? Yeah. Anyways, interrupt me if you, but let me tell you the more conspiracy-oriented aspect of it. But so, one of the slides I have on here that you can see online, but it's some work by a colleague of mine, Megan Bang, who's an Ojibwe scholar. She writes with a lot of other people, so it's a group of folks. But anyways, she looks at how when scientists began to create images of what the environment looked like for educational purposes, that one of the things that you see in those images, right, is almost no human beings. Like you see images of like ecosystems. I have a couple of examples on my slides. And it just shows like, you know, a lake or a mountain and maybe some arrows and some flows, or it might show some buildings. But you don't actually see people doing things, whether it's fun things or environmentally wise things to do. You don't see human responsibility built into that. And so when you create those images of the environment which don't have human fluidity involved in it, I think it makes it very easy for one to standardize the flow of the environment, so that wherever the origin of Four Seasons came from, it got solidified by this idea that an environment is just an image that doesn't have humans into it, and that humans would sort of have to be added into after the fact. And what's kind of interesting about that, and I think it speaks to your question as well, is that this is what we expose kids to in elementary school. Empty images of the environment, where their first taste of an ecosystem is one that doesn't really implicate humans, and they don't get to see themselves in it. So for me, it's not surprising that somebody would grow up thinking, oh, there's just 4 seasons, and that's it. And that's why also a lot of people are surprised that humans can impact the environment. That we do things that have regional impacts. And the bizarre part about it is a lot of our ancestors who didn't have a lot of the fancy technologies, they actually knew that you could cultivate a landscape across a regional scale. And they respected that power. But anyways, does anyone know that? Now I need to look this up because that's a really good question about where that exactly came. Does anyone know where it came from? Do you know?
So I'm pretty sure that in history it came from the Roman Catholics, and that had to do with when previously to that, when Julius Caesar was emperor, and that's because that's where we get the month of July from.
Oh, right.
And so there's a lot of history around that, and because, you know, before that was the Greeks, and the Greeks actually had a lot of very similar ideas in terms of how they viewed seasons to indigenous peoples as well. And then when Charlemagne came about was when Roman Catholicism really became the reign of the land. And so I believe that, I'm just saying, my guess is that that's where the foundation comes from.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I even think it's funny that, like, even if you live in a place that, like, obviously does not have 4 seasons, you're still taught to think of it in that way. Yeah, that's an interesting origin, right? So it may have corresponded back in the day to some particular region and just got transported everywhere.
But that's where we get the months of August and July from, is with Augustus Caesar and Julius Caesar.
Well, what's that whole thing with, what is it called, the Gregorian calendar?
Yeah.
Is that really, yeah, and it got mixed with some, yeah, interesting. Because you said Roman Catholic, so it's got a Christian element to it.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, and two, that was a good point you made about the Greeks as well, because one of the, speaking of education, one of the things that's ridiculous is, so my PhD is in philosophy, which is code word for the fact that I had to be forced to read the ancient Greeks. And you know what's really, really funny is that if you study in graduate school the ancient Greeks, you actually study almost everything about the Greeks, but how they related to the environment. And so it's funny in the field of philosophy, and I apologize to any philosophers who might work in that area and you know more about this than me, but I'm pretty sure I'm right about this, is that the majority of philosophical texts on the Greeks don't talk about Greek seasonality and don't talk about how their political and moral systems were tied to the dynamics of the environment. And when somebody wrote a book about that, actually, that was saying, actually, no, you can understand Greek politics and morality based on the environment and their agricultural system, that a lot of scholars were like, well, that's superfluous, that's irrelevant. And so you get a bunch of people trained, whether it's in philosophy or another field where you study the Greeks, to think that things like ancient democracy was not tied to the environment. But if you look at another ancient version of democracy, right, the Haudenosaunee, they were all about tying their system of representative democracy to very particular seasonal and environmental relationships, and that provides a powerful alternative.
Another
Please.
point I want to bring up too is that, so a lot of those records, I would say, were probably destroyed when the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, because a lot of those were in tomes back then and tablets. So you have to think in terms of the power dynamics at that time, and at that time it was the Roman Catholic Church. So
Colonialism.
yeah, always colonialism.
Right, that's a good point. You see how all
Or
those records,
imperialism.
right? I forgot about that, that they had all those records
Yeah.
and they got incinerated and, yeah. Yes.
Hi, I'm Sophia Jackson. I'm San Luis Obispo, Dene, and Putan from Arizona. I have a couple questions. Kind of want to edit them from your presentation, kind of answered a little bit. So I think that I'm going to go backwards. It says, well, this one's kind of just philosophical. Do you feel it is more dangerous now to take direct action against polluting entities now than in the time of AIM in the 70s, since our education continues to fail us and our changing systems do not change? Because I feel like now that I'm in Enwick, it's really insulting, and it's inspired me to take up American Indian Studies, to go back to the places where I took AP World Civ, a lot of classes that I thought I could butter a UW with, you know, just to look good, and it's just felt like insensitive to the person I am, because what I learned was just broad and wrong and not helpful at all, and I've broken a lot of ties with people from my high school just on those builded ignorances. So my question was more about direct action, because we're not teaching us how to change our systems at all. What do you think?
Yeah, good question. Thanks for getting us to talk about direct action. So one thing that I've just noticed in my own work is that, you know, I think right now, if this is the time for direct action, and especially when there's so many tribes that are doing it in different ways. I mean, I think all of us should be involved in direct action. And we saw with Standing Rock, and we've seen with a number of other issues, that Native people have been showing up. One thing, though, that is actually scary is that a lot of people, especially non-Native allies, they don't know what to do beyond showing up to Native direct action. So a lot of people, for example, that came to Standing Rock, that was great that they went to Standing Rock, but if you ask them, well, do you do stuff on a daily basis to support like Indigenous rights or to change policy that the United States has? And they'd be like, well, no, I don't even know what to do. And then when they want to find out what to do, who do they ask? Well, they ask one of us, and that's why our inboxes are so full of emails, right? And that's been extremely frustrating, because in an era where there's so much information available, yet it's almost like people, especially on the allies side, know less about what they can do. On the other hand, for Native people, what I find is that all of us should be involved in the direct action, but we also have different talents. There's some people that are really good at standing right in front of people with deadly weapons. And that's a talent. It takes practice to be able to do that. There's other folks that when they saw that courage being displayed, they kind of, I know it's this case, the Curtis Standing Rock, they kind of felt ashamed. They're like, well, shoot, my job in some other sector, I don't have that kind of courage, right? And so I think it's a premium for us actually to also bring out all the spheres of action where it takes courage to be effective. So that when our friends who have the courage to stand up in front of deadly weapons, all of us in our own ways, whether you're a writer, whether you're a politician, whether you're an educator, whether you're a scientist, are supporting them to the fullest extent. Because in those moments with Standing Rock, when everybody was really united, it was a nice period of time, like that was awesome. And that was tremendously powerful. Now in terms of the danger, what I think is strange to think about is that on the one hand, Native people are still physically threatened when they participate in these things. But what I saw was that some of the people that were, I'm not going to put anybody on the spot here, but some of the people at Standing Rock whose lives were being threatened, they were also facing an additional threat, which was character assassination.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's just so much surveillance and so much, that surveillance is what scares me. Because
Yeah.
I think of Zapatistas where they cover their faces for everything they do, including their meetings, because how are you gonna function in your hometown when you have half of them are Hicks and they treat you a certain
Right.
way? So I like that you brought up that point, the character assassination, because that's what always burdens me, is that you could be in Brazil and get for real assassinated, or you could be here and not be able to ever get a job, or your things renounced from you, like awards or whatever. I don't really know.
Or you be in Ferguson and killed, post-movement action. A lot of leaders were. I mean, that's one of the things we're talking about when we talk about the mask. I mean, there's a lot of philosophical aspects to it. One of them being protection of identity. The other one is the revolutionary concept that when I wear the mask, I don't represent myself, I represent the resistance, which means you can kill a person, you can't kill an idea. Going back to that character assassination, there was a lot of that at Standing Rock, people who were engaged in such methods and not understanding the ideology behind it. And when you deal with these things, what we have to understand is Ward Churchill, who has a controversial background on whether he's Native or not, the fact of the matter is he wrote an excellent book on COINTELPRO and how the U.S. government works and their operatives work against people. If you study, Bunchy Carter and his assassination at UCLA with Ron Karenga and how they pitted two people in a movement against each other simply by writing bad letters against each other with FBI forgers. To ultimately culminate into a violent act where two people were pitted against each other and one got murdered. So we have to understand that there's a reality when it comes with these resistances, and we also have to understand that we need to engage in a diversity of tactics. One of them is overtly what's happening right now, armed resistance is being vilified by those of a pacifist element who don't wish to engage in those types of things. And so, as a people, we have to come together because there's the honest questions that we have to ask, working with the organizations that you have and the level that you have. Obviously, there's an appeal to conscience, whereas some people might say that there is a conscience that doesn't exist, and we're on a time frame. So I just thought I'd interject that. Sorry.
Yeah, those are great. What's your name?
Christopher.
Oh, nice to meet you. Yeah, the just in this like three-way conversation and more ways conversation. If other folks want to chime in, when a couple times when I've gone to like South America and they've asked me to speak to like indigenous issues, like I would go and like give maybe a presentation like this or something like that, and they would be like, oh, well, we're surprised you presented on that because we thought you were going to present on the threats of being assassinated. And because all of their presentations are about that, and some extremely well-known activists there were telling me that like their kids, who are now in their mid-20s, have to be raised entirely in exile. And that's actually a normal occurrence there. So at a lot of the indigenous like justice, environmental justice conferences, what they're asking for in terms of like funding is support for like protection of activists and leaders. And this kind of reminded me, especially listening to both of what you all were saying, is about this other topic actually, is that even if there are some like Native folks that might feel that maybe here times have changed a little bit, so we're threatened in a number of other ways, but maybe not to the level you see in other parts of the world. Though again, that's false for some people, but nonetheless. But there are also other groups of people in the United States who, continue to face threats. You mentioned Ferguson. And I don't know what you all thought, but I was hoping that more Native people would have got behind African American people in those struggles, because they actually showed up for some of our work, especially at Standing Rock, but they have in other places too. And so I think that's actually a component of direct action, is to actually expand it, to realize that even if some of the particularities of struggles across people of color might differ, they were ultimately fighting against some of the very same types of problems and can be more effective together and actually have a lot to share. You know, for example, while a lot of African Americans weren't necessarily indigenous to these lands in the same way that indigenous people are, they've been here for generations. They have knowledge of the land. They have political traditions. They have cultural traditions that I think we can really identify with. And the other thing I wanted to mention too is that with regard to the direct action, and listening to both of your points, this was coming out, one of the things that's really struck me, especially after Standing Rock, but I think I was seeing it leading up to it, is that settler colonial power, as a particular type of power, you're not better or worse about it whether you're conservative or liberal, right? A left-wing person can be just as guilty of settler colonial power as a conservative person. It's an ambivalent form of oppression, right? And so what's been difficult, right, is on issues like economic exploitation, people on the left have been like, well, we're clearly better than the conservatives. But in settler colonialism, the tactics are different, but they're nonetheless dispossessing us of our land and our culture. And so this also came out with the problematic forms of allyship at Standing Rock. And so in this way, I think it presents a scenario for Native people where direct action is at a premium, because we're not actually struggling against people who are very close to changing their consciousness. And people who might have been allies historically on other issues aren't allies. And probably the most like threats and like death and hate mail I've gotten actually from anything I've ever done. And I regularly write stuff about and say stuff and do policy work on the fossil fuel industry, was when I wrote this one article and I said that the conservation movement was just as violent as the fossil fuel industry, which actually historically is true. The conservation environmental movement has displaced, killed, murdered more Native people than I think the entire like mining fossil fuel hat, right? And like environmentalists, liberal environmentalists wanted to kill me for that, right? But it's completely factually true, you know? Yeah.
Just to expand on that a little bit, I think the conservation movement that's happening is a very inherently racist idea, and this fact that there's this wilderness that we have to protect that keep people out of it. And they aren't really addressing the fact that this wilderness actually used to be habitated by Native people and should be, you know, relocated, or not relocated, but given back to these Native people. And I think that I've often asked this question of a lot of non-Native conservation or environmental justice people, and Native people too. I constantly ask, how do we become better allies? Because that is a huge issue. We have a lot of people who have this motivation and energy and passion, and we have some commonalities. There's like this intersectionality that still happens. So I wonder, you know, is it our burden to have to tell non-Native people how to be better allies? Is it their responsibility to learn how to be better allies without knowing what we need? You know, and I wonder how we kind of try to navigate that kind of like very tumultuous and often dangerous common ground that we have.
Yeah. Do you have some ideas?
I honestly, I think like it's, for me, it's like leading by example and taking like the slow road of just like writing a lot of stuff that gets to multiple, you know, groups of people. And I know that there's a lot of people who say that they want it faster, they want it to be more impactful, or all of these different things, but I don't know. I don't know what's right or wrong, but I don't know if anyone has any ideas on that.
Yeah, you all should let me know. I mean, that's, well, folks are thinking about stuff on that topic. So, you know, we see this both with people that are doing like direct action, but also with people that, you know, work at Northwest Indian College or work in other types of jobs where you're having to assert a native presence. And one of the fastest ways to get burnt out is by teaching, recalcitrant people, about how to be good allies, right? And not only is it painstaking when people don't have the type of history information, but then people don't learn, right? And they don't learn fast enough. So one of the things I've seen a lot more people today, and I think it's a very positive thing to turn to, is that actually it goes back to an issue of time, is that, for us, if we're about the business of kinship relationships, then, similar to something in an earlier discussion that Professor Blue was talking about, there's a lot of positivity in our community, and it would be a shame if any of us got burnt out on trying to teach other people, right, how to be good allies and miss out on all of the positive things that are happening in our communities. And I shouldn't be quoted on this because this is a bit of a tricky thing to say, but I think Native people will understand this, is that, like when our colleague back there was talking about urgency and that we need to obviously address these issues now because they're so immediate. Even when you were asking about direct action, right? There is an immediacy, but that doesn't mean that we're going to let immediacy be our sole determining aspiration. Because similar to what happens when you get really fixed on something, right? Like, I want to buy this one thing, or I need to get a good grade in this class. The minute you put all of your eggs in one basket and one thing becomes that in which you focus your entire life on, that's when you begin to do things that break down your ethical and moral relationships and responsibilities with other people, right? Urgent people, busy people, late people, right? People that are saying, oh, I have to get the best grades or else my whole life is over. Completely ignoring the fact that you survived for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years before you even got into that class and you were fine. Yet you'll poison every relationship you have, right? Including with your own mom, because you're adamant that you must put everything aside to just do well in that one class because everything supposedly, rides on that. And it doesn't. And so what I think we're learning is that we need to actually realize that our timeline isn't going to necessarily wait for the other folks to catch up. And that might mean that they continue to pose a lot of challenges and threats to us, to say it euphemistically, into the future. That might mean they might destroy the whole world. But we're not going to endorse a solution to that violates consent, that violates trust, that violates reciprocity. And in a weird way, scholars that I admire, like Native scholars like Jeanette Armstrong or Mary Arquette, they say things in their writing that I think a lot of non-Native people think are horrible things to say. They'll say things like, well, maybe it's not all going to work out for the world, right? Right? Maybe it won't. But that doesn't mean that in order to save a species or to save a particular way of life, that we're going to continue to move forward in a non-consensual, untrustworthy, a non-reciprocal way. We're not going to sacrifice kinship because of the allure of immediacy, because almost every colonial strategy that was ever used, if you look historically at it, at the culture surrounding it, it was all about immediacy, right? The dams that were put in this region were supposedly to strengthen from the Cold War threat, to strengthen us from the Cold War threat. That's why Native people didn't consent to it. That's why they did it in an untrustworthy way, because they believed in immediacy. So I think we're learning a kind of bizarre, this is my opinion, a bizarre lesson about allyship, that maybe they are just going to have to learn from themselves, and that we're not going to distract from the positivity in our communities and wait for them to learn. Yeah.
And I think that's a huge part of this westernized way of learning is that we have these roles and responsibilities for people outside of our communities. We have these other colonizers who came in and established schools within our tribal areas to teach us how to be. And I feel sometimes we're kind of mimicking that and going out and telling people how they need to be for us. But in reality, I kind of see a lot of success in tribes of people are saying, we're just going to do our thing. And we're just going to make sure that we succeed and do the thing that we have wanted, our people to be, and just try to
do the things to make that happen. I don't know, maybe I'm just way too optimistic or naive, but I feel like those are some really positive changes in indigenizing our future.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, great points. Who is next? A couple of parents.
Michelle can go
Are
first.
you sure? And then at Michelle's question, we're gonna do a formal closing, and then we're gonna be able to continue the visit, but I just know for the okay. time.
I just want to add to the conversation, and you know, as an Indigenous person within academia in a very westernized, colonial institution, one of the things that I'm learning is exactly what Kyle said: is that burnout is real, and so as my inherent responsibility as a descendant of the bloodlines they could not kill, I now walk the talk of I have a certain amount of accountability, that relational accountability. And that could be to those extended families, to your nations, but at the same time, colonization wants you to remove yourself from that relational accountability. And as Robin Kimmier consistently talks about in her scholarship and a lot of her presentations, is that colonization also wants to teach you that knowledge does not have a particular type of responsibility for us as Indigenous peoples. And so by me taking on that extra lens of my knowledge has a particular type of responsibility, then I have to push back and ask myself, who is morally fit to have that knowledge? And that may sound a bit harsh, but it's a way of me decolonizing the narrative, like taking back the discourse. And it will fall on deaf ears. But at the same time, I have an accountability to this young lady, to a lot of people who I consider to be extended family. And family is my shield in which I protect, right? And and it's in being in the institution, it teaches you that. It teaches you that it doesn't matter the acronyms you have behind your name. It doesn't matter what nation you say you are. You are an entity that must assimilate and colonize and walk in a certain way to be successful. And to decolonize the discourse, to take back that narrative, to empower yourself, you have to say, well, my knowledge has a certain type of responsibility, and it's not accountable to you, right? Either you hear me or you don't. Either you see me or you don't. But I'm still going to exist regardless. And it's hard to navigate. It's not easy by any means at all. It takes a lot of chocolate and tea late night conversation.
I was going to say pretty much the same thing, and just that, to add to that, also that I think it's really important that we be really intentional about these things, and that we make the choice to choose each other in those spaces. And for me personally, like you talk about burnout, like yes, hallelujah, I know what that's like. And so for me, what I have found is like I have to be really intentional about who I entrust that knowledge to, and those allies then become like you have to let them know that that's kind of their job, that you're going to share that with them, but then part of that reciprocity, right, is moving that forward and training other allies. And so you have to be really intentional about that. And yeah, self-care, make sure that you're tending to your family and you're tending to yourselves and your unit, because without that support, we can't all keep doing it together. And I think it's really burdensome, because oftentimes I feel like we Indigenous people are looked to like for all the answers, right? And I don't know about y'all, but I've had times where it's like, oh, she's an native environmental scientist, ask her. She knows the answer to that. It's like, no, we don't. We don't know all the answers. And I love when people like Jeanette Armstrong make that, they put that caveat out there and say, maybe it is all going to go down the, but at least we're trying, and this is what I know, and this is how we can go forth in a good way about it.
Yeah, great point. Well said.
Well,
Professor Norman, did you?
I apologize. I hate to wrap up the wonderful dialogue, and I think we can stay longer, but I want to do a closing, and Tim Ballou Sr. is going to do a closing. Stigma is going to assist, so thank you.
Little side joke. Well, first of all, I really believe that we need to give another round of applause. I really hope you guys took 2 or 3 key words that he spoke about today. As for me, I did. And they're important words. And I really like your question, Ms. Willop. That's how we, I don't want to say we won Cherry Point, that's how we kept Cherry Point. But anyways, it was good for me to listen. I hope you guys understood some of the words he explained. The important thing is we're still here as Native American people. And not kinship, that was one of the words I wanted to question him about, but I'll not do it today. But anyways, we have kind of a quick ceremony. Our faculty member,
Yes.
I forgot her name.
I'm a movie star.
I'll let her introduce herself.
Stigma.
Steve.
We have a high school for you. And because you did present words of wisdom, we hope some enlightenment. We would like to thank you.
Thank you much. Thank you.
And we have goodies in here.
Well, my hands are full.
Well, that's why we put them in here right first. This way I walk back with it.
All right, thank you very much, Professor. I appreciate it. Thanks all for coming and hanging out and chatting. Look forward to staying in touch. Send me an email.